She did not buy a man and his daughter to save them. She used her last coins, the very last clinking remnants of a life that had already been taken from her, to buy them for herself. What happened in the days that followed was not a kindness, but a reckoning, and it would leave the entire town drowning in the tears they refused to shed for her until it was far too late. Before we delve into this story of dust and desperation, let us know in the comments where you are watching from in the world, and please subscribe if you appreciate tales that linger long after they are told. The heat of the auction square was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from dust, sweat, and the low, murmuring hum of judgment. Ilara stood at the edge of the crowd, a ghost in a gray dress, her presence as thin and frayed as the hem of her sleeve. She was a forgotten corner of the town's memory, a woman who had pulled the shutters down on her life years ago and had not been seen to raise them since. The townsfolk, a gallery of sun-hardened faces and self-righteous certainty, barely registered her. To them, she was simply part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the withered oak that cast a skeletal shadow over the proceedings. But today, something sharp and unfamiliar was awake inside her, a shard of glass turning in her gut. It was the little girl. The girl, no older than 6, stood with a stillness that was profoundly unnatural for a child, her small hand swallowed by the calloused grip of her father. The man, a cowboy whose dusty clothes spoke of long roads and short luck, stood tall on the crude wooden platform. His name was Samuel, the auctioneer had barked, a man of some skill with horses but none with money. He was bound by debt, his labor and his child's future collateral for a failed venture. The crowd saw property. They saw a strong back for the fields, a small pair of hands for the scullery. They assessed his worth in bushels of wheat and cords of wood. Ilara saw the way the man's shoulders were a fortress around the child. She saw the girl's eyes wide and dark, not with fear, but with a terrifying, vacant resignation. It was a look she knew. It was the look of a world that had ended, the hollow space left behind after the screaming stopped. A tremor went through Ilara, a phantom echo of a cold, silent morning in her own past. The bidding was sluggish, demeaning. Men offered insulting sums, haggling over a human soul as they would a lame horse. The banker, a man whose heart was as round and hard as the coins he hoarded, smirked from the front row. It was his debt, his profit. Ilara felt the small, heavy weight of the cloth pouch tied at her waist. Inside was everything. The last of the money from the sale of her husband's tools, the pitiful savings she had guarded like a dragon, a sum meant to last her through a winter that promised to be as cruel as all the others. An irrational, feverish pulse began to beat in her throat. She saw her own empty farmhouse, heard the oppressive silence that screamed from every corner, felt the ghost of a small hand that no longer reached for hers. The final bid was announced. A pittance. The auctioneer's gavel was poised to fall, to seal the fate of the man and his daughter, to send them into the grinding gears of servitude. And from the back of the crowd, a voice, raspy from disuse, cut through the air. "I'll pay it." A collective turn of heads, a wave of disbelief. Ilara stepped forward, her shadow stretching long and thin before her. She untied the pouch, the metallic sound of the coins spilling onto the auctioneer's table a deafening proclamation. It was everything she had, every last cent. She had not bought a man and a child. She had bought a reflection, a desperate, impossible chance to fill a silence that was eating her alive. The walk from the town square to the farm on the edge of the dust-choked plains was a pilgrimage through a landscape of silence. 3 figures moved against the vast, indifferent sky, each locked in their own private prison. Ilara walked ahead, her back a rigid wall of unexpressed emotion. She did not look back, could not bear to see the 2 shadows that trailed her, bound to her now by a handful of coins and an act of what the town would call madness. She could feel their presence like a brand on her skin, a constant, unnerving awareness. The man, Samuel, walked with a deliberate, steady pace, his tall frame casting a long, protective shadow that always seemed to cover his daughter. His wariness was a palpable thing, a low hum of distrust that vibrated in the air between them. He had been sold, and this strange, silent woman was his new master. Her motives were a locked box, and he carried the cautiousness of a man who had learned that locked boxes rarely contained kindness. Beside him, the little girl, Lena, was a specter of childhood. She took 2 steps for every one of her fathers, her gaze fixed on the cracked, dry earth beneath her feet, as if the world beyond that small patch of ground was too terrible to behold. The dust kicked up by Alara's worn boots settled on their clothes, a fine gray powder that seemed to coat everything in a film of sorrow. For Alara, every step was a journey into memory. This was the path she had walked with her husband, their hands clasped in a promise of a future that the land had eventually swallowed. This was the field where her own daughter, Sarah, had chased butterflies, her laughter a bright, shimmering thing that Alara could almost still hear if she closed her eyes and held her breath. But when she did, the laughter would curdle, twisting into a choked silence, the memory snapping shut like a rusty trap. She flinched, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. The silence of the walk was not empty. It was filled with the ghosts of words that could not be spoken. What could she say? I bought you because my house is too quiet. I bought you because your daughter has the same dark hair as the one I lost. The truth was a monstrous, selfish thing, too ugly to be given voice. Samuel, for his part, studied the woman. He saw the way her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. He saw the tension in the line of her shoulders. This was not the posture of a benevolent savior. It was the posture of someone carrying an immense, invisible weight. He tightened his grip on Lena's hand, a silent promise of protection against a threat he could not yet name or understand. As they crested the final rise, the farm came into view. It was not a place of prosperity. It was a collection of weary buildings huddled together against the vast emptiness, the wood of the barn and house bleached gray by years of unforgiving sun. The place looked as haunted as the woman who owned it. A crow cawed from a crooked fence post, a harsh grating sound that seemed to mock their arrival. This was not a rescue. It was a different kind of cage, and as the farmhouse door creaked open, revealing a dark and Spartan interior, all 3 of them understood in their own way that they had simply traded one form of desolation for another. The interior of the farmhouse was cool and dark, the air thick with the scent of old wood, dried herbs, and a profound, settled loneliness. It was a space scrubbed clean of life, not with soap, but with grief. Every surface was bare, every corner shadowed. Alara moved through it with the economy of a phantom, lighting a single lantern that pushed back the gloom with a weak, trembling light. The flame threw their shadows, long and distorted against the bare plank walls, making them seem like giants locked in a silent, uncertain dance. She led Samuel and Lena to a small room at the back of the house. It contained a narrow bed with a patched quilt and a small rickety washstand. It was stark, but it was clean. "This is yours," she said, her voice a low murmur, barely disturbing the quiet. She did not meet their eyes. She placed the lantern on the stand, its light catching the fear in Lena's wide gaze, the guarded appraisal in Samuel's. He nodded once, a sharp, tense movement of his head. He said nothing. His silence was a shield, his stillness a form of defiance. He was a prisoner here, and he would not give his captor the satisfaction of gratitude or complaint. Later, in the main room, Alara placed 3 wooden bowls on the rough-hewn table. The meal was as sparse as the house, a thin stew of potatoes and wild onions, and a piece of hard, dense bread for each of them. They ate in a silence so complete, it was a physical pressure against the eardrums. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against wood, and the soft crackle of the small fire in the hearth. Alara watched them from across the table, her face an unreadable mask in the flickering firelight. She watched the way Samuel broke his bread in half, giving the larger piece to his daughter. She watched the way Lena ate with a slow, deliberate precision, as if she were afraid the food might be snatched away. In the girl's small, serious face, Alara saw the ghost of another child at this very table. A memory, sharp and excruciating, pierced through her carefully constructed numbness. Sarah, her face smeared with jam, banging her spoon on the table, her laughter filling the small room with a light brighter than any lantern. Alara's hand tightened on her own spoon until her knuckles were white. The pain was so sudden, so visceral, it stole her breath. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floorboards, and retreated to the shadows near the hearth, turning her back on the table. She could not bear to watch them any longer. From his seat, Samuel observed her sudden retreat. He saw the tremor in her shoulders, the way she wrapped her arms around herself as if to hold herself together. It was not anger or cruelty he saw in that moment, but a profound, deep-seated brokenness. He began to suspect that the chains that bound this woman were far heavier than the indenture contract he carried in his pocket. Later that night, long after Samuel and Lena had retired to their room, Ilara sat by the dying embers of the fire. She held a small, worn rag doll in her hands, its button eyes missing, its yarn hair unraveled. It was Sarah's. She had found it tucked away in a chest, a relic of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. With a needle and thread, her fingers moving with a slow, forgotten familiarity, she began to mend it. Stitch by stitch, in the deep, silent dark of the house, she was not just fixing a toy. She was trying, desperately, to sew together the frayed edges of her own shattered world. The days that followed fell into a rhythm of silent labor. The sun would rise, painting the vast, empty sky in hues of pale pink and orange, and find them already moving. There were no orders given, no schedule dictated. Samuel simply rose with the dawn and went to the fields, his body remembering the familiar cadence of farm work. He moved with a quiet, powerful diligence that was almost unnerving. He assessed the barren soil, cleared stones with his bare hands, and began the back-breaking work of turning the earth, preparing it for a planting that felt more like an act of faith than a practical endeavor. He was a man who knew the land, who understood its stubbornness and its potential. He worked not with the resentment of a servant, but with the grim determination of a survivor. Ilara worked alongside him. She would emerge from the house as he made his way to the fields, her movements as quiet and deliberate as his. They were two solitary planets orbiting a common, silent sun. They rarely spoke. A nod to indicate a shared task, a gesture to point to a tool needed. Their communication was a pantomime of necessity, a language of shared toil that required no words. The space between them was charged with unspoken questions, with the heavy weight of their separate pasts and their intertwined, uncertain present. The town, however, was not silent. Eyes watched from a distance. The sight of the strange recluse working her land alongside the black man she had bought was a spectacle that fueled the flames of gossip and suspicion. Riders would pass by on the dirt road, slowing their horses to stare, their faces a mixture of contempt and prurient curiosity. They saw scandal. They saw impropriety. They saw a disruption to the rigid, unspoken order of their world. One afternoon, the sheriff arrived, his horse kicking up a cloud of self-important dust. He was a man whose authority was derived not from a sense of justice, but from the reinforcement of the town's prejudices. He dismounted with a practiced, intimidating slowness. "Just making my rounds, Ilara," he said, his eyes scanning the property, lingering on Samuel, who had stopped his work and stood straight, his face a mask of neutrality. "Making sure everything is in order." The implication hung heavy in the air. He was not here to ensure her safety. He was here to enforce the town's moral code. Ilara met his gaze, her own eyes as hard and unyielding as the dry earth beneath their feet. "Everything is in order, Sheriff," she replied, her voice flat, betraying no emotion. "Then you won't mind if I have a word with your man." He gestured dismissively toward Samuel. Ilara stepped slightly, placing herself between the sheriff and Samuel. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was a clear and defiant statement. "He is busy. I am busy. If you have business here, you can speak to me." The sheriff was taken aback, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He had expected the timid, broken widow of memory, not this woman of stone. He held her gaze for a long moment, a silent battle of wills playing out in the oppressive heat. Finally, with a grumble and a sneer, he mounted his horse. "Just remember your place, Ilara," he warned before turning and riding away. Ilara watched him go, her expression unchanged, but inside, a cold fire was burning. The town's judgment was a cage, and she could feel its bars beginning to press in on her. The world wanted to put her in a box, to label her and contain her, but something was changing within her. The quiet, desperate act of buying a man and his daughter was forcing her out of her own self-imposed prison, pushing her into a confrontation she had spent years avoiding. The silence was broken not by a storm or a shout, but by the smallest of sounds, a child's voice. Several days into their fragile, unspoken routine, Lena had begun to emerge from her shell of silence. She would follow her father to the fields, a tiny shadow trailing a larger one, and sit on a rock watching him work. She held the mended rag doll, the one Ilara had repaired, in a constant, tight embrace. Its new button eyes stared blankly out at the world, a silent companion in her quiet existence. One afternoon, as Ilara was drawing water from the well, she felt a tentative presence behind her. She turned to see Lena standing there, clutching the doll, her dark eyes fixed on the bucket. For a long moment she just stood, poised on the edge of speech. Then, in a voice as soft as a whisper of wind through dry grass, she asked, "Is the water cold?" The question was simple, mundane, but for Ilara, it was a cataclysm. The sound of a child's voice in the yard asking a simple question was a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for years. It cracked open the door to her memory, and the past came rushing in, not as a vague echo, but as a vivid, agonizingly real flood. Suddenly, she was no longer standing by the well in the harsh afternoon sun. She was in a different time, a different life. She saw a small girl with hair the color of corn silk, her own daughter, Sarah, splashing in a metal tub in this very spot, her squeals of delight echoing in the warm evening air. "Is the water cold, Mama?" The memory was so clear, so painfully tangible, that Ilara could almost feel the spray of water on her face, hear the joyous laughter that had once been the center of her universe. The vision was warm, golden, a perfect moment preserved in amber, but as quickly as it came, a shadow fell over it. The golden light began to fade, the laughter growing distant, replaced by an encroaching, dreadful silence. The memory of Sarah's life was inextricably bound to the memory of its end, a bright, beautiful tapestry with a single, horrifying tear ripped through its center. Ilara gasped, her hand flying to her chest as if to hold in the sudden, sharp pain. The well bucket slipped from her grasp, clattering against the stone, the sound yanking her back to the present. Lena flinched at the noise, taking a step back, her eyes wide with alarm. Ilara stared at the child, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. For the first time, she was not just seeing a reflection of her loss. She was seeing a child, a real, living, breathing child, who was afraid of her. The realization was a second blow. Her grief, her private, selfish sorrow, had become a source of fear for this little girl. The truth of what she had done, the sheer desperate madness of it, washed over her. She hadn't been mending a doll. She had been trying to create a replacement. She hadn't been buying a servant. She had been trying to buy back a ghost. The weight of this confession, a confession she had only made to herself, was crushing. She sank to her knees by the well, the rough stone biting into her skin, and for the first time in years, a tear traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The sky had been a bruised purple for hours, the air growing heavy and still with a charged, electric tension. A storm was coming, not the gentle, life-giving rains of spring, but a violent, furious squall, the kind that ripped and tore at the land with a wild, indiscriminate rage. It was a mirror of the turmoil that had been building within the small, isolated farmhouse. The first gust of wind hit like a physical blow, rattling the windows and moaning through the eaves. Then came the rain, a torrential downpour that turned the dusty yard into a roiling sea of mud. From inside, they heard a sickening crack, followed by the splintering groan of old timber. A section of the barn roof, weakened by years of neglect, had given way. Panic, sharp and primal, cut through the suffocating quiet that had defined their existence. The few animals they had, 2 goats and a handful of chickens, were in that barn. The winter feed, their meager hope for survival, was stored there. Without a word, Samuel was on his feet and out the door, running headlong into the maelstrom. Ilara, jolted from her stupor of grief, was right behind him. The roles of owner and servant, of captor and captive, dissolved in the chaos. They were simply 3 people fighting a common powerful enemy. The wind tore at their clothes, the rain blinding them as they struggled against the force of the barn door. Inside, the scene was one of destruction. Rain poured through a gaping hole in the roof, soaking the hay and terrifying the animals. Working together in the dim, chaotic light, a frantic, unspoken coordination took over. Samuel, with his raw strength, began heaving sacks of feed toward the one dry corner. his muscles straining against the waterlogged weight. Ilara, her movements surprisingly deft and certain, scrambled to herd the panicked goats into a secure stall, her voice a low, calming murmur that was somehow audible above the roar of the storm. Lena, who had followed them out, her small face streaked with rain and fear, did her part. She chased down the frantic chickens, her small hands gently but firmly gathering them and tucking them into a wooden crate, her childhood fear momentarily forgotten in the face of a clear and present purpose. In the heart of the storm, they were a unit. Ilara saw the fierce, unwavering devotion in Samuel's eyes as he constantly checked on Lena, even as he worked himself to the point of exhaustion. He was not just a laborer. He was a father, a protector of the highest order. Samuel saw a strength in Ilara he had never imagined. She was not the fragile, broken woman he had assumed her to be. In the face of crisis, she was resilient, capable, and possessed a core of tempered steel. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. They worked until their bodies ached, until they were soaked to the bone and covered in mud and hay. When the last sack was moved and the last animal secured, they stood together in the relative shelter of the damaged barn, their breath coming in ragged plumes in the cold, wet air. The fury of the wind began to subside, the rain lessening to a steady, drumming beat on the remaining roof. They had not saved everything, but they had saved enough. They had weathered the storm, and in the shared struggle, in the mud and the rain and the fear, the foundation of something new had been laid. The silence between them was no longer one of distrust and uncertainty. It was a silence of shared exhaustion, of mutual respect, of a fragile, unspoken bond forged in the heart of the tempest. The fire in the hearth crackled, a warm and living thing against the deep, wet quiet left in the storm's wake. Their clothes, damp and steaming, hung from a line strung across the main room. Exhaustion had stripped away their defenses, leaving them raw and exposed. Ilara poured 2 cups of a potent, home-brewed liquor she kept for medicinal purposes, the sharp, herbal scent filling the air. She handed one to Samuel, their fingers brushing for a brief, electric moment. She sat in her usual chair, he in his, the table between them no longer feeling like a barrier, but a shared space. Lena was asleep in the back room, clutching the doll, a small island of peace in the house's emotional sea. For a long time, they just sat, sipping the harsh liquid, listening to the fire and the slow drip of water from the eaves. The silence was different now, heavy with things that needed to be said. It was Ilara who spoke first, her voice low and rough, as if dredging the words up from a deep, painful well. "I had a daughter," she said, her gaze fixed on the flames. Her name was Sarah. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. She just spoke to the fire, confessing to the dancing light. She loved this farm. She used to say the sunflowers followed her when she ran through the fields. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a fleeting, painful thing. She was 6, the same age as Lena. The unspoken comparison hung in the air. "There was an accident," she continued, her voice growing thinner, fraying at the edges. "The old tractor. My husband was working on it. He didn't see her run behind it. It was so fast." She fell silent, the memory a chasm that threatened to swallow her. The raw, unvarnished truth of it lay bare in the small room. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with Samuel's quiet, patient attention. He did not offer platitudes or empty comforts. He simply listened, giving her the space to let the poison out. "I didn't buy you to be kind," Ilara finally whispered, the confession tearing from her with a physical shudder. "The silence in this house it was so loud. I heard her everywhere, in every empty room. I saw your daughter and I just wanted to see a child on this land again. I wanted to fill the quiet. It was selfish. It was madness." She finally looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, her face a mask of self-loathing. She expected judgment, contempt. Instead, she saw a profound, weary understanding in his gaze. He took a slow sip from his cup before speaking, his own voice a low, steady baritone. "My wife, Martha," he began. "She died giving birth to Lena. The doctor's bill, the funeral, that's where the debt began. I tried to make it right, took a job breaking horses for a man who promised a bonus he never meant to pay. One bad fall, a lame horse, and he claimed I owed him for the animal. It just, piled up. He looked toward the closed door of Lena's room. She's all I have left of Martha. She is my whole world. Every day I just try to keep that world safe for her. He looked back at Alara. We all do selfish things to survive our own private storms, ma'am. We all try to fill the quiet. In that moment, across the small table their griefs met. His story of loss and debt, her story of loss and silence. They were not the same, but they rhymed. They were two people who had lost the center of their lives and were now just trying to navigate the fractured pieces left behind. The chains of indenture, of ownership, of suspicion finally fell away, burned to ash in the fire of their shared human sorrow. The fragile peace they had forged in the aftermath of the storm was as ephemeral as a morning mist. The world outside their small pocket of understanding had not changed. It had been watching and waiting and judging. The town's gossip, once a low murmur, had grown into a chorus of righteous indignation. News of the arrangement at the old widow's farm had festered, twisted by prejudice and fear. The catalyst for its eruption was the banker, Mr. Gable, the man whose greed had set these events in motion. He had seen the transaction not as the settlement of a debt, but as the loss of a valuable asset he could have controlled for years. He felt cheated, and his wounded pride, coupled with his inherent racism, was a potent poison. He began to sow seeds of discord in the town saloon, in the general store, his words painting a lurid, dangerous picture. He spoke of impropriety, of a lone white woman living with a black man, a violation of the town's rigid, unwritten laws. He hinted at danger, at the threat this man posed, conveniently ignoring the presence of the small child. He played on their fears and their biases like a virtuoso, and soon, the town's suspicion curdled into a dark and unified anger. The confrontation came on a bright, cloudless afternoon that felt like a mockery of the darkness that was about to unfold. A cloud of dust on the horizon heralded their approach. It was not a lynch mob with ropes and torches, but something almost more sinister. A mob of civic self-righteousness. They came armed with law books and judgment, led by the sheriff, his badge glinting in the sun, a symbol of the town's corrupt authority. Mr. Gable rode beside him, his face a smug mask of vindication. A dozen other men followed, farmers and shopkeepers, their faces hard and set. They stopped at the edge of the property, a formidable line of hostile intent. Alara and Samuel were mending a fence when they arrived. They stood up together, the tools in their hands suddenly feeling useless against the wave of humanity before them. "Alara," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying an official, unyielding tone. "We're here on behalf of the town council." He held up a piece of paper. "There have been concerns. Complaints have been filed regarding the nature of your household. We have reason to believe the terms of the indenture contract are being violated." Gable spurred his horse forward slightly. "The contract is for labor, not cohabitation," he sneered. "We're here to take the man and the girl back to town. The contract will be reevaluated. They'll be assigned to a more suitable situation." It was a thinly veiled threat. They meant to tear them apart, to punish all three of them for daring to defy the town's expectations. Lena, who had been playing nearby, ran to her father's side, her small hand gripping his pants leg, her eyes wide with a terror that was now all too real. Samuel placed a hand on her head, his body tensing, every muscle coiled and ready. He stood like a mountain, a silent, powerful bastion of defiance. The tension was a razor's edge. The sun beat down, the air was still, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath. This was the true storm, the one they could not fight with physical strength. This was a battle for their dignity, for their fragile, nascent family, and it would be fought not with fists but with something far more powerful and far more dangerous: the truth. This was the moment the past 7 years of Alara's life had been leading to. All the silent grief, the withdrawn emptiness, the slow, agonizing process of shutting down her heart. It had all been a long, cold winter, and now, facing this wall of smug, righteous men, she felt the first fiery crack of a thaw. She was no longer the town's ghost, a pitiable recluse to be whispered about and ignored. Standing there with the dry earth beneath her feet and the warmth of a child's presence just behind her, she was simply Alara, a woman, a mother who had lost her child. and she would not allow another to be taken on her land. She took a step forward, a deliberate, solid movement that drew every eye. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The quiet intensity that radiated from her was more commanding than any shout. "There is no violation," she stated, her voice as clear and cold as well water. "Samuel has worked this land harder than any 2 men you could name. He has earned his keep and more." The sheriff scoffed. "That's not for you to decide, Alara. This is a matter of public decency." Decency? The word fell from her lips, laced with a contempt so profound it made several of the men shift uncomfortably. "You speak to me of decency? You who stood by and watched a man and his child be sold like cattle for a debt designed to be impossible to repay? You who would see a father torn from his daughter for the sake of your own discomfort and prejudice? Where is the decency in that, Sheriff?" She turned her gaze on Gable, her eyes burning with a cold fire. "And you talk of contracts. The only thing you value is the coin in your pocket. You would render a man's life, a child's future, down to a number on a ledger. That isn't business. It is a sickness of the soul." A stunned silence fell over the mob. They had come expecting a fight or a frightened surrender from a broken woman. They were not prepared for this articulate, ice-cold fury. They were not prepared for the truth of their own actions to be held up to them like a mirror. Samuel, seeing her stand for them, for him, took a step forward himself, moving to stand not behind her but beside her. His presence was a silent, powerful affirmation. They were not master and servant. They were partners in this defiance. The sheriff, recovering his composure, blustered, "This is not a debate. We have the authority." Alara held up a hand, silencing him. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the folded, worn indenture contract. She held it up for all to see, the legal document that bound Samuel and Lena to servitude. "This paper," she said, her voice ringing with newfound power, "is a symbol of your indecency. It is a testament to a world that values profit over people, a world that allows men like you to sleep at night believing you are righteous." Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she tore the contract in half. The sound of ripping paper was like a gunshot in the still air. She tore it again and again, letting the small white pieces flutter to the ground like dead leaves. "He is a free man," she declared, her voice resonating across the field. "His daughter is free. They will remain here on this land, with me. This is my home, they are my family, you are trespassing, leave." It was an act of profound, illegal rebellion, but its moral force was undeniable. The men in the mob stared at the pieces of paper on the ground, then at the woman of iron who stood before them. For the first time, some of them looked ashamed. They saw not a scandal, but a woman defending her own, and they saw the ugliness of what they had become. The aftermath of the confrontation was not a triumphant celebration, but a vast, ringing silence. The mob, their righteous fury broken against the rocks of Alara's conviction and their own dawning shame, disbanded. They did not retreat in anger, but dispersed slowly, quietly like a mist burning off in the morning sun. They mounted their horses and turned their wagons around, avoiding each other's eyes, avoiding the unwavering gaze of the woman on the hill. They carried a new weight with them on the ride back to town, the uncomfortable weight of self-reflection. What happened next, what left the town in tears, was not a single dramatic event, but a slow, creeping flood of consequence. The story of Alara's stand, of her tearing the contract, spread like a contagion. It became a dark legend, whispered in homes and argued over in the saloon. For some, it sparked anger and resentment. They saw a world turned upside down, a dangerous precedent set. But for many others, it forced a painful reckoning. Mothers looked at their own children and thought of Lena. Husbands looked at their wives and saw a flicker of Alara's fierce, protective strength. They began to see the fine lines of their own moral compromises, the small cruelties they had overlooked and accepted as normal. The tears were not of sorrow for Alara, but of shame for themselves. They wept for their own silence, for the part they had played in her isolation, and in the casual degradation of Samuel. They wept for the community they thought they were, and the one they saw reflected in Alara's defiant eyes. Back at the farm, the three of them stood in the quiet dust, the torn pieces of the contract the only evidence of the battle that had been waged. The air was different, the weight of servitude, of ownership had been lifted, but a new, uncertain reality settled in its place. They were free, but they were also more isolated than ever. They had defied the town, and the town would not easily forget. In the days that followed, a new rhythm emerged. It was still quiet, still filled with the hard work of coaxing life from the stubborn land. But the silence was no longer one of tension or grief. It was a silence of peace, of companionship. They worked together, their movements synchronized, a family forged not by blood but by fire and shared defiance. Samuel was no longer just a father protecting his child. He was a partner in building a future. Ilara was no longer a ghost haunting her own past. She was the fierce matriarch of a fragile, unconventional clan. One evening, as the sun set, casting long golden rays across the fields they had tilled together, Lena ran through the small patch of new green shoots. She was chasing a butterfly, her laughter real and unrestrained, floating on the warm air. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. Ilara and Samuel stood on the porch watching her. Ilara did not flinch from the sound. She did not retreat into the painful memory of another laugh, another time. Instead, a genuine, gentle smile touched her lips. The sound did not replace the one she had lost, but it wove itself alongside it, a new thread of light in the tapestry of her life. The farm was no longer silent. The future was unwritten, a vast, open plain like the one that surrounded them. They were still poor, still outsiders, but they were not alone. The land was still hard, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a very long time for all three of them, it felt like home.